We are diving into telepractice today. Today's episode is a can't miss episode. If you're thinking about going into telepractice, speech pathologists are loving telepractice. The research suggests that they're highly satisfied with telepractice. They like the flexibility of the working conditions in which they can travel, they can stay at home. Find great fulfillment in treating children through telehealth. The question we need to ask is it as effective as in-person therapy when it comes to treating speech sound disorders? We're going to dive into what factors matter and what factors you can control to make telepractice effective. Before we begin, I need to give you a disclaimer, and that disclaimer is this. We do not have random controlled trials, statistically significant research that we can reference. Those studies have simply not been done. What we have are small N studies. These are studies that showed for these 8 children, for these 2 children, for these 4 children, telepractice was effective. That means it doesn't apply to the kiddos on your back porch. It only applies to those 4 children, 2 children. What we're going to do is what I think of as the recycle bin approach. We're going to go through this recycle bin of research. We're going to try to piece together, let's just call it this trash, right? And we're going to try to make something out of it. And we're going to try to make something out of it so that we can deliver something to our students that's of value. I think of it as we're making a Valentine's. We're putting on together all the colorful pieces. We're making something neat out of it, and we're going to use it on Monday morning. So this is us getting really scrappy with the limited research we have available. When it comes to telepractice, not everyone's a good candidate. I've been there, I've done that. If the child has severe attentional challenges, severe behavioral challenges, doesn't have a caregiver that is going to be actively involved on a consistent basis, telepractice is just off the table. It's simply not a good option. So you really do want to go in person with a child that has these difficulties. Also, if it's a severe motor speech disorder that requires touch cueing and requires a high level of dynamic cueing that really involves a lot of proxemics. I have a lot of kiddos that really need me kind of in their face a little bit to show them with my mouth how to cue the sounds. It's really not going to transfer well through a screen. That's when you're going to want to consider in person instead of through a screen. What are we going to do to make telepractice effective? What worked in these studies? What were active ingredients where they did say, hey, we were just as effective as what we did in person? And these active ingredients were what we do in person through telepractice. We made sure that the telepractice was reliable to what works in person. So if your teletherapy is looking like a session that you would do in person, odds are it's effective. So what do we have to consider? The first thing you want to consider is the dose. When it comes to the dose, we're going to think about how many reps a session. Now, I say this with a caveat because, for instance, you see here in my therapy approach, I use a paragraph with multiple 3-element, 2-element clusters embedded in it, very complex language. This paragraph is gold. It gives you a lot of gains. If you're a SIS member, you've used it, you know the gains you get, and it's on all levels. It's across domains. Do I do this paragraph 75 to 100 times in a session? No. Do I get more gains than I would if I did single words 75 to 100 times in a session? Yes, I've done the research there. I get much greater gains, and I'm only going to be doing this perhaps 8 times in a session. They'll be reading this highly complex paragraph. It's not just about the reps, it's also about the complexity of the target. For instance, if you're lifting 50-pound dumbbells, you do not need to do 75 to 100 reps in your workout. If you are lifting 3-pound dumbbells, the same principle applies when it comes to speech sound disorders. If you are carrying a complex load, a heavy load, you do not need to do 75 to 100 reps. If you are working at the single word level, you do. The single word level is 3-pound dumbbells. You need to do a high level of reps. My research showed when I worked with children with childhood apraxia of speech, I had greater gains doing the paragraph than multisyllabic words 100 times a session. I had greater gains doing a paragraph 6 times a session. More than how often when it comes to dose, it also has to do with the complexity of the load. Challenge creates change. One is challenging in maybe an endurance manner, which you're doing high reps. The other is challenging in a complexity manner that's going to create a lot of neuronal connections because of its complexity. When we're talking about dose, I want you to think of dose as more than just there's the dose in terms of the number of reps. I want you to think about dose in terms of how powerful it is. Like, this is very powerful stuff, the paragraph is. If you haven't tried the paragraph, you know you get very big gains, not only in speech, but also in language. You also see gains in attention, in literacy, in syntax. You're going to see gains across the board. And that's because it's powerful. When we're thinking about dose, you can do it less often, like get a smaller dose, if it's a really complex target. When you're doing telepractice, I will tell you this, when I was working with the 3-year-olds in telepractice, I would go to a sentence strip that was complex. That's because these were young 3-year-olds. They're looking at a screen for the first time. They look kind of like a deer in the headlights. And the paragraph was a bit much. I still had great gains with doing this complex sentence. I did have to consider that when you're looking through a screen with a 3-year-old, you're going to have a drop in attention. And how are you going to adapt in the face of that? And when it comes to your target, the best research we actually have in telepractice is using complex clusters. This complex cluster research is really interesting. It just came out, and I'll make sure to reference this at the bottom of this episode because they knew that initial clusters are powerful, generalize across positions of words, and you get all of these earlier on treated sounds that you're not even touching for free. It's really great stuff. But they said, what about final clusters? If you have a child with a speech and a language impairment, and for instance, they're dropping the morphemes at the ends of the words, can you get your cake and eat it too by having complex clusters at the end of words? They were looking at things like ks, the ka s sound that we spell it orthographically as s at the end, or they're looking at that verb such as something that you colored and you have that rd at the end. And they were looking at those clusters at the very end of words and focusing on those. And what they found is through telepractice, they found what I found, which is you're going to get gains on all of these earlier developing untreated sounds by working on final clusters. This is really interesting research to me, and I'm going to leave this in the show notes because I'm changing my SIS membership in which I'm thinking about some of our home practice activities. I have these little booklets I make for the kiddos in our SIS membership. I'm going to go ahead and dab into some final clusters that were used in this article. So I thought you might want to check it out too. It's fun always growing at the drawing board with you and trying out new things and looking at the research and saying, how can we DSD? And that's something we're going to DSD on in the SIS membership this year. Okay. So another thing they looked at when it came to evidence-based approaches is the program length. They said that they saw the gains, but it took 3 to 4 months minimum for gains to occur. So I want you to remember that because with speech sound disorders, the research indicates for generalizable gains to occur, it typically takes about 2 months. A lot of times people will be doing speech sound disorder therapy, and then they'll maybe probe something and say, okay, let's see how they do on these words. Like, I don't see progress. I think I need to do something different. You don't need to do something different. It just takes a couple months for it to generalize. Don't lose heart if you're not seeing gains. If the children are making positive practice and therapy, if they're at that 80% criterion, good things are happening. You're improving their motor planning, you're improving their motor programming, you're improving execution, you are making neuronal connections. The generalization will happen. The research indicates you have to give it 2 months. We have some length of time that we're doing the therapy in order to see the gains. I was happy to hear that this complexity approach is actually effective through telepractice. the multiple oppositions approach, which is a type of complexity approach, and the cycles approach were also effective through telepractice. When I say these are effective through telepractice, these are studies which they had two children. And they did the approach through telepractice, and then they did the approach and they looked at the gains. They did the approach in person, they looked at the gains, and they said, okay, these two children, they made gains in telepractice just as much as they did in person. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the research. Remember, this is research from the recycle bin. We're putting something together. We're going to call it a present, okay, at the end of the day. But it's not really a present because it's kind of, it is what it is. It's the thought that counts. We're being resourceful, we're being scrappy with what we have. We're going to look at the caregiver involvement. If you don't have the caregiver involved, they're not a good candidate for telepractice. If you do have the caregiver involved, there's some ways that they can participate. One way is to monitor. We want to tell them the 80% rule. We want to let them know that we need to make sure that at all times the child is 80% effective. So we're going to need their help on providing the cues to ensure that the child is 80% effective so that we're actually having accurate motor planning, accurate motor programming, accurate execution, and we're not having a child that's frustrated. We don't want them at 90% either. That's too easy. We want them at that perfect challenge point. The caregiver that is next to the child actually has to be actively involved in cueing the child and giving you feedback and monitoring the child at all times, and also controlling the materials in the activity. They really are the co-therapist role. They're not just sitting there, and if there's any tech issues, they're going to take care of the tech issues for you. There's that home practice. I want you to work on the word. If they want something, they're going to tell you yes, and they're going to keep the teeth together. We're not going to have the lisp S. So you're going to give them that home practice activity that they do throughout the day to support what they've done in therapy. The caregiver, the co-therapist, in this case in telepractice, is going to make a big difference when it comes to the outcomes. We're also thinking about the progress monitoring. Like I said before, wherever possible, you want to use standardized measures. The reason for that is I see a lot of speech pathologists are actually measuring practice effects. They're looking at the target that they're practicing on a regular basis and saying, oh, they've improved on these targets. We want generalizable gains every 2 months, as I said, because that's how much time it takes to see the generalizable gains. What I recommend is giving that same standardized single word speech test that takes 5 to 10 minutes to give. If you're a SIS member, I'm excited because tomorrow I am going to give you a Google Slides deck speech screener. And the reason I'm doing this is my SIS members were telling me my school district does not allow me to give a standardized speech test to a child unless I get explicit parent permission. That would take a long time to get parent permission from all of the parents 4 times a year, every quarter, to monitor growth. So what I did instead is I created a Google Slides deck speech assessment that looks at the clusters, single in the initial and final position, that looks at diphthongs, that even looks at 3-element clusters. So they can quickly go through that on their laptop or on their iPad with the child, and they can get a criteria measure. Okay, we have this many errors, and these are the sounds we have errors in. And then later on, the second quarter, the errors, if things are going well, the errors are going to go down really significantly. And then the third quarter, you're going to see another decrease. And then later on, you're going to see another decrease. The way it works with the complexity approach, it's kind of like losing weight. It's very powerful. But when you first lose weight, you lose all these pounds. And then at the end of the school year, you're working on those R's. You are down to the last 5 pounds. If you've ever been on a diet, like those are the hardest. So the rate of progress is going to slow down as you get closer and closer to the child's goal. In the beginning, you're going to see huge gains when you do the complexity approach. And then as you get to the more complex targets, now we're getting to these hard sounds that we're conquering at the very end. That's when we're getting off the bike and we're walking the bike. That's the way the complexity approach works. It's pretty exciting in the first half of the year when you see all of these untreated sounds spontaneously develop because you're working on a complex paragraph. It is exciting. So how you can monitor, this is for my CIS members. Your CIS member, I'm going to be giving this to tomorrow, and I'll make sure that it's in the treatment target library so you can always reference it. For the CIS members, it's going to be a screener where you can go through and you can see all the sounds in the beginning and the ends of words. You can look at the multisyllabic words, you can look at the clusters, look at the three-element clusters, look at their diphthongs, see where they are 4 quarters a year. You're not going to get in trouble because it's not a standardized formal test. All of this red tape. I don't want you to get tied up in red tape. That's not why we're here. We're here to make the world a better place. We're here to be agents of change. We're not here to tie ourselves up with red tape. In closing, what I want you to know is do what you do in person when it comes to telepractice. And realize that telepractice is not for everyone. If you don't have an actively involved co-therapist or caregiver, if the child has attentional challenges, if the child has severe behavior challenges, the child has a severe motor impairment, then telepractice is probably not a great option for this kiddo. In that case, you're going to want to do in person. But the research is suggesting if those are not issues, then telepractice is going to be effective if you follow the evidence-based practices that you do in person. That said, do what you do best and roll up your sleeves and make the world a better place, one child at a time. You are always going to be first.